Sehr verehrte Frau Direktorin, magnifice Rektor, sehr verehrte Frau Staatssekretärin, sehr verehrte Vorsitzende des Wissenschaftsrates und sehr geehrter Herr Vorsitzender des Jubiläum-Netzwerkes. Es ist ja für mich eine ganz große Ehre und Freude, hier wieder zu sein. Ich hatte Anlass, unzählige Male an wissenschaftlichen Veranstaltungen hier am ZEF anwesend zu sein. Und wie gesagt, schon gesagt worden ist, war ich auch einige Zeit Mitglied des Wissenschaftlichen Beirates, was eine große Freude und Ehre auch war. Und ich war tatsächlich auch im Jahr 2007 Mitglied einer Kommission für die erste Evaluierung des ZIF unter Vorsitz von Wolfgang Frühwald und mit Konrad Osterhammer und Willem Krull als die anderen Mitglieder. Ich weiß nicht, ob unsere Ratschläge eine Bedeutung gehabt haben, aber trotzdem. Und es ist eine wirklich große Freude, hier zu sein. Ich werde leider meine Rede in englischer Sprache halten. Ich bitte darum um Entschuldigung, aber jegliche Diskussion nachher können wir natürlich auf Deutsch führen. Und ich war darum gebeten, 20 Minuten lang zu reden. Es wird ein bisschen kürzer sein. Na, ja, warten Sie mal. Es ist schwierig, ins Englische hinüberzugehen. In any way, very much has been said already about the history of Institutes for Advanced Study, and I will try to avoid repeating too much of that. As you know, the first institute is the famous Princeton Institutes, and the stated purpose was, I quote Abraham Flexner now, to promote the free pursuit of learning to the utmost degree that the facilities of the institution and the ability and faculty of the students will permit. It should be a free society of scholars, free because mature persons animated by intellectual purposes must be left to pursue their own ends in their own ways. Among the sources of inspiration were All Souls College at Oxford, where Flexner had actually spent a year, resulting in the series of lectures that is publishing in the book on American, British, and German English and German universities. A book that is fascinating to read. I don't think its analysis is entirely correct. He has a much too low opinion of the achievements and accomplishments of American universities, but it's a very interesting book. Another source of inspiration, of course, was the Collège de France, and not least, Flexner's studies and inspiration from German universities. He had studied himself at Johns Hopkins University, which was in reality in the late 19th century kind of German university transplanted into America. And the idea of a Humboldtian university and the Friedrich-Wilhelms-Universität to Berlin, the current Humboldt University, was of course the main source of inspiration for him. Now, the IIS at Princeton sought at the same time to embody a Humboldtian idea of a university, an Oxford tradition of commensality, contemplation and tranquility, and also a French tradition of engagement represented by the Collège de France. I will say I should be very brief now, so I had much more to say about it, but it's quite clear that the Princeton Institute is formed in a period that the intellectual historian H. Stuart Hughes, in a classic book from the late 1958, Consciousness and Society was published in 1958, and then he published a couple of years later a book called The Sea Change. But what H. Stuart Hughes has called a sea change in the intellectual landscape of the world, namely that the transplantation or the transformation of the system so that a lot of European science actually did change across the seas, the Atlantic Ocean. And Einstein was mentioned, but of course the Princeton Institute that was established it was created formally, legally in 1930, but it opened its activities in 1933. It included, of course, not only Einstein, but John von Neumann, Kurt Gödel, Hermann Weil, and Emil Noether from Göttingen. So it was, and still is, actually, to a large extent, very much of a Germanically impregnated institution. If you go to the library, it's a classical German university or learned library. I would say, however, that both the Princeton Institute and some of the subsequent institutional creations were very much created through the confluence of structural conditions and contingencies. So the Princeton Institute emerged in this crucial period of transition of higher education, in which American universities were emerging as international leaders. This is also a time when some of the American universities were still very much characterized, had traces of anti-Semitism and racism, not least Princeton, which was very much a Southern university. The first rector of Jewish origin at Princeton was Michael Shapiro in the 1990s, not just coincidental. But it was also, of course, very much marked by the epistemic transformations that occurred in the 1930s, the advances of the natural sciences, but also very much of a reorientation in the cultural and social sciences. You may remember that the first edition of the International Encyclopedia of Social Science emerged in 1934, much more historical than later editions. You may remember that scholarly programs for sociology, with Parsons as a paradigmatic example, for economics with Keynes, statistics with Fishers, and history of the Annales School, and in linguistics, Max Jacobson. All of those were formed in the 1930s. So it is a period of deep rethinking across scholarly fields. A contingency, of course, was that there was funding available through the very generous donation of $5 million from Mrs. Corinne Bamberger-Fult and her brother, Mr. Louis Bamberger, and I won't go into the complex family history, but Mrs. Bamberger-Fult had become a widow in January 1929, and they decided that the company that which her husband Felix Fult and Louis Bamberger had founded together with yet another person, Louis Frank, that they should sell that. They did that shortly before the stock exchange crash in the autumn of 1929. And then it was set up, and it was originally meant to be a learning institution. And it had the right to give doctorates. No doctorates has ever been awarded by the institution. And they gave the task to the major university reformer of the first half of the 20th century, namely Abraham Flexner, who had this vision of something else. The American historian Philip Geiger has written in his, Roger Geiger, I mean, I know him since the 1970s, has written in his major book about the growth of American research universities 1900 to 1940 that very soon this institute became the new center of the natural sciences. He has argued that it became the greatest concentration of mathematical talent in the United States and probably in the world, and I mentioned some of the names in this context. Many other prominent mathematicians, apart from those I mentioned, entered the United States through the Institute and later found permanent academic posts elsewhere. And as mentioned, the Princeton Institute has, I think it's now still 33 Nobel laureates. They have the vast majority of recipients of the Fields Medal. They have 16 of the 18 recipients of the Abel Prize. And I think they have a couple of the recipients of the Holberg Prize, of which I'm myself a member of the prize committee. So it is an eminent institution, and it had very few successors. One small success, which I cannot go into now, is the Dublin Institute for Advanced Study that was directly modeled on the Princeton Institute, and Schrödinger was recruited there. It still exists. It's not a member of either the CIAS group or the UBIAS group or the NetJAS group, but it still exists. And it was the favorite child of the then President of the Irish Republic, Edmund de Valera. Now, the second period, the second wave or second institute that created is the famous Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. And when you think about that, there are still a series of contingencies that have to be reflected upon. So one is the transformation of the image of scholarly research that was formulated in the United States in the immediate wake of the war. In July 1945, Vannevar Bush, who had been director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, played an important role in the renaissance of the activities of the National Science Foundation, published a famous book on Frontier, the Endless Frontier. And in a sense, what Bush did was to formulate a doctrine whereby the societal relevance of the sciences could be fully recognized, But an institutional order was created that allowed for the scholarly community to interact, to preserve the autonomy of the scientific curiosity-driven research. So the role of the peer review system was much enhanced and strengthened in this process. Much can be said about that, but I won't say anything more. But it's a very important period in that respect. Secondly, of course, this is a period of the Emergent Cold War. And the major social science here of the times, structural functionalism and the Parsonian version of it, was of course a theory that allowed for a theory of modernization and functional differentiation and allowed for making possible a conception of the transformations of the world that was in a sense in conformity or had affinity to this political situation. Thirdly, it was a period in which the United States played a much greater role in international scholarly interactions than had previously been the case. You have a whole range of new international scientific associations that are modeled and supported by the United States, very much through UNESCO, and the earlier, often French-dominated situation with the International Institute is being supplanted by this new version. And fourthly, and most contingently, there had been the initiative through the Ford Foundation to make a donation for a scholarly institution. And the Ford Foundation just sounds like any foundation. The eminent British and American historian, Sir David Cannadine, is involved now in a project writing the complete history of the Ford Foundation. And we may forget, for instance, that the endowment of the Ford Foundation at this time was about twice the amount, combined endowments of Harvard and Yale. And at this point, sort of the Ford Foundation moves from basically being a foundation doing benefactory work, patronizing work for the city of Detroit and some American other environments, to becoming a global actor with what would in effect is intellectual embassies spread across the world. And one component of this then was the support for the second institute, which was formed at Stanford. And Stanford University, of course, was at that time not one of the 2 or 3 leading universities in the world. It was much lower down in any possible ranking. But it had access to the linear accelerator and to this new institute, both of which were extremely important instruments for the growth and status of Stanford in the ensuing years. Now, still in the 1960s, there were basically these 2 institutes. So the idea to use them, to draw on them, to create new institutes on a more wider scale occurred in Europe in the 1960s. And it had as its background the expansion of the university systems, the period which Martin Trow, the American sociologist and higher education scholar, has termed the transition from elite to mass higher education. Secondly, in the 1960s, there occurred something of a revolution in public policies. There were efforts to draw research much more closely to societal and political objectives than had previously been the case. I will not go into details about that, but it's a very pervasive process. Thirdly, however, you have in 1972 the first UN conference on the global environment. That is which took place in Stockholm, incidentally. And there have been a series of those afterwards. And that marked a kind of shift towards a new engagement with global interconnectedness and the realization of the need to explore links between culture and natural sciences to come to terms with those global contingencies much more effectively. So jointly, these processes entail that Institutes for Advanced Study appear to many people as an increasingly attractive instrument. So for some, it presented the possibility of a haven of seclusion and quality away from the turmoil of rapidly growing and sometimes turbulent academic environments. For others, however, they seemed as places where you could, free from constraints of disciplinarity, pursue research that cut across those boundaries. And it also presented an image of a scholarly environment characterized by intense seminars, commensality, and informal interaction in which eminent senior scholars could, as they did in the American Institute, interact closely with early career scholars. So it appeared to be a possible but very forceful instrument for the support of early career scholars. And this is very much the background of ZIF. And of course, if you read Helmut Schelsky and remember what he said to the German Rektorenkonferenz on the occasion of the bicentennial of the birth of Wilhelm von Humboldt, when he says that the spirit of the von Humboldt brothers are very much threatened in the German Mass University, but is still alive in some of the American Institutes for Advanced Study. And that was part of the vision of the creation of ZIF. So ZIF is the first European institute of this type, unless it's followed possibly in the next year by the institute in Edinburgh for the humanities, but at a much smaller scale. And then you have the initiatives in NIAS, where Uhlenbeck, who had been at the Stanford Center, came back and wanted to do something similar for that. And the NIAS, the Dutch Institute for Advanced Study in Humanities and Social Science, is still very much characterized by the tradition of Stanford. I mean, when I was a fellow there in the early 20th century, they still didn't have telephones in the offices, which of course had been to provide seclusion and peacefulness. But of course, at that time, people were using cell phones, so it was irrelevant. They had given it up at Stanford at that time. And in Israel, you have the Israeli Institute for Advanced Study that at the Hebrew University that was created in 1975. Some years later, you have the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, 81, the IWM, Institute für die Wissenschaften von Menschen in Vienna in 82, and our own collegium in 85, which drew strong inspiration from ZIF, and I will say one or two words about that later. Still, in the settings of the old world in general, and the increase of institutes was modest and gradual, and the real expansion of Institute for Advanced Study is something that occurs from the 1990s and onwards. Now, 2 decades into the new century, we must reflect on the situation that we are no longer in a situation where there are just a handful of institutes for advanced study. There are, the figure 150 to 200 was mentioned. Actually, Peter Goddard, who was then director of the Princeton Institute, and I were asked to do an evaluation of a university-based institute in Canada, and we told them that you have to realize that you have many competitors, and they didn't believe us, so we started actually counting, and we came up precisely with this number. I think the number, and we didn't count Humanities Research Institute, which there are many in American universities. So if you, with a generous count and with the growth in the last decade, you would come up with a much higher number. And of course, I will not tell you, but depending on how you count, you have at least 30, maybe 40, maybe even more institutes for advanced study in Germany alone. And in Britain, a cautious count came up with something like 20. And of course, there is an enormous variety. I will not go into the German situation, even if I've been involved in quite a number of these institutes in various capacities. But I think the German scene is one of the most interesting in the world because there is a richness of instruments. You have traditional institutes, you have universities that are free from universities, you have institutes that are emerged largely in the wake of the Exzellenzinitiative. You have the highly interesting, to my mind, Käthe Hamburger colleagues, and you have, of course, the Kollegforschungsgruppen supported by the DFG. And this variety is, I think, a very rich resource that one really should reflect upon, and it provides enormous potentials, and I think many of them are doing, or most of them are doing extremely important work. Now, what this means that we have to reflect, I think, on the rationale and the role of these institutes. And now I have to be very, very short. So you have to reflect that upon the fact that there have been important changes taking place. So one such change, of course, is the sheer growth in number of institutes. Another important change is that both the higher education scene in general and the scene of Institutes for Advanced Study is a much more global one now than it used to be. We have heard about this a little bit earlier, but that has very profound implications for what these institutes do. They are also existing in a competitive environment where obsession with rankings, bibliometrical measures is much greater than it has been before. And they have also to reflect upon a situation in which the scholarly landscape itself is changing in epistemic terms. This means that, for instance, for university-based institutes, they will be free zones, free areas, Freiräume for free thinking, but they will also inevitably have to reflect upon their relationship to the universities in which they are based. To my mind, the most feasible path for such institute is probably to have as much institutional autonomy as possible, while seeing to it that it draws on and at least indirectly serves as an important stimulus for a single university or a group of universities, as is the case with the Kulturwissenschaftsinstitut. For the highly respected national institute, and of course you have absolutely preeminent institute of that type in Germany, the Wissenschaftskolleg, they may seem to occupy an enviable position by virtue of the national role and function as a complement to the regular system of universities and university-based institute. So while this role is acknowledged and admired, it is also easy to oversee the fact that it depends not only on legal regulation, but on the wisdom, caution, and constant effort to secure it on the part of its key supporters and its leadership. And this has been done, of course, eminently skillfully in the German case. There has also occurred efforts by the European and American institutes to engage globally in rather ambitious ways. A first step of that type was the creation in 2007 of the IERN, the Indian European Advanced Research Network, which is unfortunately no longer quite as active as it was. A small thing in which we were involved was the initiative from the Princeton Institute to create a summer program going over 3 years and involving interactions also between the summer sessions. It was a collaborative effort of the Princeton Institute, the École des études en sciences sociales, and our collegium, where we invited, after an open call, 20 scholars from Latin America, the Near East, and Africa to participate in a program that was designed not only to produce reports, but to give these scholars a sense what it meant to be at an Institute for Advanced Study. And we have the growth of international associations. We have mentioned CIAS, that we founded in 1991, NETIAS, that was to complement that in 2004, and now we have JUBIAS, and we also have, generously thinking, the Consortium of Higher Education Institutes and Centers. Now, what are the roles and what are the dilemmas of these institutes? Now, I think all institutes for advanced study are, and I'm quoting rather from the conditions of membership in both NETIAS and CIAS, that they should be committed to support the research of the highest quality. They should have at the core a competitive program where scholars can be invited, or groups of scholars, as is the case of CIF. Furthermore, it must be an interdisciplinary environment. It should not just be where you meet colleagues and you could have met them anywhere. It must be a scholar where you do your work. It doesn't necessarily have to be interdisciplinary itself, but it should be in an international interdisciplinary environment. And I can think of few, if any, institute that provides such an environment more efficiently than CIF. And they should also preferably have a stable funding. Again, CIF is exemplary, and they should have an independent status, whether they are formally part of a university or not. And CIF has, I think, upheld such a scholarly intellectual autonomy throughout its existence. If they do that, they can perform, I think, 4 major functions. They can be a space for a free and unconstrained research in a research environment that is near optimal. We heard the term field site, but it's not only field site, it's a lot of stimulus that occurs in such an environment. I think time and time again, scholars have been at our institute say that this is what I believe an institute for advanced, what this academic life would be like when I entered it. Often it wasn't in the normal university environments. And when you read the reports of former fellows, even decades after they've been fellow, they are so grateful for the support they have received. They say this was one of the most productive periods. You cannot trust them immediately after they've been, because then they are either pressed for time or they are so exhilarated. But if you ask some years afterwards, and they still say this, that must mean something. But it's also, of course, an environment that provides a very important vehicle for the support of early career scholars. I would have liked to say something about our own Professura Scientia program, but I think skillfully used, there are few instruments as efficient for the support and encouragement of early career scholars as institutes for advanced study. And I can note that in the last 10 years, CIF has strengthened its activities even more. It was always there, but now it's really an impressive array of instruments that are used to support early career scholars. And they are also, of course, as our friends in Berlin always used to say, they are breeding grounds for genuinely new ideas. And the need for such new ideas is greater the more you have strategic programs characterizing the regular life of universities. There must be some spaces where you can think in a completely free way. However, doing that, fulfilling and choosing between these functions, requires that you also are aware of the constraints. So funding constraints is one which is very, very clear. I mean, I will not talk about it, but I think Europe should have had more institutes more generously funded than we have today. I could go on at length to that, but I won't. I think generally European institutes are drastically underfunded. Secondly, they exist in a landscape where there exists, as Frau Bockmann has just said, a variety of instruments. So you have, of course, instruments for the support of already excellent research, and in Germany there are many such instruments. The Sonderforschungsbereich is one, excellence clusters is another, and this is extremely important and valuable. You also have instruments that try to promote the growth of genuinely new formulations across disciplinary fields. This idea of having advanced research networks. I guess to some extent I think you have a number of such instruments. One interesting institution of this type is, of course, CFAR, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, which is not an institute for advanced research, but a secretariat that supports the growth in a long term, up to 15 years in the normal case, of groups rethinking the scholarly landscape. We are trying to do something like that in Sweden, and I hope that the new Nobel Center will engage in activities, and when we do now include the natural sciences, we work in this way. And then you have to Institute for Advanced Study, we are physically present. But if you are directing an Institute for Advanced Study, you must be able to think strategically about the relationships of these various streams of knowledge, of support. So for instance, if there is an advanced research network that works over several years, now there could be times when members of that group want to sit in peace and quiet together. Conversely, it often happens, I think, that scholars who are in residence at an Institute for Advanced Study want to develop further some idea, want to do that over a sequence of years, and they have to do it. Finally, we will have to think about the question of outcomes in some way, and I will not talk much about the way in which I think the Wissenschaftskolleg supported the establishment of the Institute for the Max Planck Institute for History of Science, in the way in which our work, together not least with French economists, led to the creation of the International Panel on Social Progress, where we tried to do in the social sciences what the natural sciences and climatologists had done with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But here at CIF, I can say there are many such networks that have had great importance, and for us, in our foundational stage, the program here on Staatsaufgaben, already mentioned, with Dieter Grimm as a key person, was extremely important. Jürgen Kocker's work on Bildungsbürgertum was extremely important, and we saw the interview with Peter Weingart, which was done here at CIF and at Bielefeld on Wissenschaftssoziologie, was of the greatest possible importance. So there are many such ways. And my conclusion from all of this is that institutes for advanced study must demonstrate that the selective nature of the process of assessing candidates and theme groups and fellowships does not entail a withdrawal from the world, or a withdrawal from or indifference to the situation in the academic world as a whole, nor in the public sphere at large. The resources at the disposal of European institutes might be limited, but even so, they all have an obligation to demonstrate an interest in and openness to the wider world of scholarship and discussion. Thank you very much.